Hi, g'day. In this video, we're going to learn all about social identity theory. To me, when I was first starting out in psychology, I thought this was one of the hardest theories to get my head around. But once you comprehend it, once you understand it, it's an excellent theory because you see it everywhere. You'll start seeing social identity theory and the behaviors associated with it everywhere you look around you and in the media. So on the surface, if you approach it in the wrong way, it can be complex, but we're going to break it down in this video, and I think you're going to find it really helpful and really interesting. Okay, so hopefully by the end of this video you'll be able to summarize social identity theory, and part of that means to be able to use the theory to explain the behaviors, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, as well as intergroup conflict. Remember that a theory in psychology is always aimed at explaining a behavior or a cognitive process. So a good way to always, when you're writing about a theory, just think to yourself, what behavior am I using this theory to explain? And social identity theory was devised to explain prejudice and discrimination and intergroup conflict. So when you're summarizing the theory, that's what we have to be able to do. You should also be able to evaluate social identity theory. So that means be able to describe the theory, explain the evidence, explain applications and limitations. And we'll talk about that as the video goes on. And so actually on that point, let's make a deal. When you're evaluating theories in psychology, a good acronym I like to use is D.E.A.L. D-E-A-L. So describe, summarize. You have to be able to summarize the theory, which means explaining how the theory explains a behavior or a cognitive process. Then you need the evidence, right? Where's the evidence to support the theory? So you have to be able to explain the studies and not only describe the studies, aims, methods, results, but clearly explain how they support concepts in the theory. And then we have applications. The theory is only as useful as its application. If we can't use the theory to apply it anywhere, it's not much help. So we have applications, and then we have limitations. So we're going to go through the D-E-A-L in this video for social identity theory. A little bit of background, a little bit of context. So I think this always helps understanding a theory before we jump straight into it. So understanding the background can really help. Developed by Henry Tajfel and John Turner. So Tajfel was Polish, but he moved to Britain, where he got into his social psychology work. And SIT came about in the 1970s. Important to note, I think that Tajfel was a Polish Jew, and he was highly influenced by his experiences in World War II. He was a prisoner of war. Of course, his parents being Jewish, he had first-hand contact with the Nazis and the Holocaust. And like a lot of social psychologists and a lot of people after World War II asked the question, why? Why would people treat each other like that? How could the Holocaust happen? What are the psychological mechanisms behind that? And so social identity theory may go some way to explaining that type of behavior, right? That extreme type of discrimination and intergroup conflict that we saw in the Holocaust. So as I said, he was a prisoner of war, and then when he went to Britain, he studied prejudice and nationalism. And so social identity theory is in part a response to realistic conflict theory. So just a recap, if you haven't studied the theory, realistic group conflict theory suggests, this came about in the 1950s and 60s by the Sharifs, that conflict between groups happens when there's competition for resources. Tajfel and Turner didn't refute this theory. They said that it's a good theory. It makes sense. There's evidence to support it. But their question was, well, what if there is not conflict between the groups? And we can see intergroup conflict even when there's when there's no competition for resources. They're saying we can see conflict between groups, but I can't see any competition for resources. So how do we explain that conflict? And that's what social identity theory does. So it follows on. It kind of fills in a gap that realistic group conflict theory left about explaining conflict. So realistic group conflict theory is great to explain when there's competition for resources, and we see that in colonialism, right? The indigenous peoples and the colonial powers often clash because they were fighting over land and resources. That's one example. But social identity theory said, yeah, but we don't always see that it's a result of competition for resources. So how can we explain that? Now let's get into social identity theory. First, this is the important thing to remember, is that it's explaining conflict between groups. That's what the theory does. So we have to remember that. And the key premise is that in part the conflict is caused because we join a group. Because we're in a group, this is what leads. It's just the fact of being in a group that can lead to conflict. And partly this is because we have this innate desire to create a positive social identity. Our social identity is how we view ourselves in relation to the groups we belong to. So you'll have, there are lots of things that would make up your social identity theory. Perhaps the family that you belong to, right? Your last name, what school you go to, clubs you attend, if you're a member of any groups, All these things go into it. Even your social group, right? Your type of friend, your types of friends. I know when I went to school in America, I was really amazed that it was just like it was on the telly, right? You had the jocks and the cheerleaders and the goths and the grunge people. It was very, very distinct, and people had these social identity theories. We didn't quite have that in New Zealand to the extent that I saw it in America. Anyway. So to create our positive identity, we tend to, and this is according to the theory, that we view our out groups negatively and our in groups favorably. And this bias in our thinking can lead to things like discrimination. So here, and we're also going to prejudge people based on which group they belong to. So at the core of social identity theory is this idea of dividing people into in groups and out groups. So some important terms you'll need to know, and I hope you'll know these by the end of this video. And you'll need to give a full summary of social identity theory. You'll need to talk about social categorization, social comparison, the self-esteem hypothesis, positive distinctiveness, and perhaps the out-group homogeneity effect, which I think is very helpful if you are trying to use it to explain stereotypes. We'll go through all of these terms in this video. Part of the evidence as well comes into the minimal group paradigm. So social categorization, I would argue this is the first step of the process. We're categorizing, we're putting things into categories, we're putting people into categories. My in-group and the out-group. Right? And so we're distinguishing us and them, in groups and out groups. This is the first step in the process. If we're not thinking about groups, then the social identity theory doesn't work. Okay, and so I've got an example here. Sports fans, sports teams. Rivals, right? Lakers and Celtics. You might think I'm a Celtics fan, and then you think, all right, I'm thinking about the Celtics fans versus Lakers fans, us and them. Alrighty, and what I would urge you to do is, as you're trying to comprehend social identity theory, look for examples around the groups that you're aware of. So look at any groups that you know are in conflict right now, and then try to apply these processes to them. Applying these ideas to real-life concrete examples that you're familiar with is going to be the best way to help you understand it. And so what you could do is get a piece of paper, write down these terms as we go through them in the video, and then write some groups that you know are in conflict with each other right now, and then see if you can apply these processes. It'll make these abstract things a lot more concrete. Because the examples I use, I don't know, they might not make much sense. Right, so after we categorize us and them, we compare. It seems like a natural next step, right? We categorize, then we compare. And so we're making direct comparisons between our in-group and our out-group. And again, I'm a sports guy. I'm going to use a sports analogy. Sports rivalries, and even if your school has a rival school. We have a school right next door, and we make comparisons all the time. And whenever I use social identity theory, I get my students to talk about how would they describe our students, how would they describe the other school's students, and because there's a competition there. And again, not necessarily competing for resources, but there's a competition there, and there's, I wouldn't say conflict, but there's a tension. And so making these comparisons is just natural. And what we tend to do is we tend to make biased comparisons. We tend to view our in-group favorably and the out-group negatively. And why do we do that? Well, Tajfel and Turner in the social identity theory would argue because it's self-esteem. And this is a really important part of the social identity theory, is the self-esteem hypothesis. According to Tajfel and Turner, we have an innate desire to increase our self-esteem. Seems to make sense, right? And how we belong to groups can help if our group is a superior group, if we belong to good groups, if our groups are better than others, superior groups. This is going to boost our self-esteem. Now, how do we make sure our groups are better than the others? Well, this is where discrimination, prejudice can come into it. If I think negatively about the out-groups, it's going to make my in-group seem better. If I treat out-groups differently, it's going to make my in-group seem better. And so this is partly how social identity theory can explain those behaviors. I'm going to prejudge you based on which group you belong to. If you're in our group, I'm going to judge you negatively. If you're in my in-group, positively. And then I might discriminate against you based on which group you belong to. So to break down the three behavior stereotypes, right? This social identity theory could easily explain why an in-group has positive stereotypes. I want to view my in-group favorably to boost my self-esteem, so I'm going to stereotype. I'm a goldfish, right? All goldfish are awesome. We're cool, right? That guy's a green fish, all right? All green fish, they're thieves. They steal all our water. I don't know. I don't know what fish stereotype. But anyway, easy to see how social identity theory could lead to negative stereotypes for out-groups, positive stereotypes for in-groups. Harder to see how social identity theory could explain the opposite, positive stereotypes for out-groups, and negative stereotypes for an in-group member. So it doesn't apply to all stereotypes. Prejudice. I'm going to negatively prejudge out-groups. What? He's a green fish? Man, that guy must be a thief. right? So based on the group that he belongs to, then I'm going to judge. And that might, according to the theory, make me feel better, right? Because I'm going to say, man, he's a greenfish. He's not part of my group. All those greenfish are thieves. He's a goldfish. Yeah, goldfish are cool. Bring him in, right? He's part of us. Like that's boosting our self-esteem. Discrimination. So then this naturally leads on. So stereotypes can lead to prejudice, which then might naturally lead to discrimination, where I say, well, he's a greenfish. Don't let him in our club. We don't like greenfish because they're going to steal all the water. We don't want him in our club, right? So and then now I'm making, because I'm excluding someone from our out-group, I'm making my in-group seem better. Again, sorry to hammer the point home, but it's boosting self-esteem. Now, another important concept is this idea of positive distinctiveness. What this means is, and by the way, a lot of these terms, social comparison, social categorization, positive distinctiveness, the self-esteem hypothesis, social identity theory, if you think about the name, it kind of gives away what it is. So do try and just think carefully about what the things are called, and it does help tell you what they are. They're pretty appropriately named. Positive distinctiveness, I want to make my in-group distinctive, different from the out-group. But I want to make it not just different, I want to make my group better. So positive distinctiveness. I'm going to make my in-group better than the out-group and different. And so, and this desire, once again, right, can help fuel bias, prejudice, and discrimination. It's really important to remember here that prejudice and discrimination are based on treating people differently based on the groups that they belong to. And this is at the core of social identity theory. I'm going to think about you and treat you differently if you're an in-group or an out-group. And then so then following on from this, if we discriminate and we're prejudiced against out-groups, then this can lead to conflict, right, and aggressive actions. If you're being discriminated against, it's not nice. It might lead you to react with an aggressive action, or you might be openly aggressive in discriminating against other people. Another important concept is the out-group homogeneity effect. Now, homogeneity means appearing all the same, right? If something's homogeneous, it means very similar. And so the out-group homogeneity effect is a psychological phenomenon where members of out-groups, out-group members tend to seem more similar to one another. Okay, and whereas compared to our in-groups, we tend to view our in-groups as we're all individuals. How can you judge us as one? Look, we're so different from one another. But that group over there, yeah, they're all such and such, right? And so, yeah, we tend to see out-groups as being more similar. And this can explain stereotypes. If you think a stereotype is a broad generalization of a group of people. Now, it's very easy to make a generalization if you think they're all similar, right? And so then that naturally leads to stereotypes. So I think the out-group homogeneity effect, part of social identity theory, is very good for explaining stereotypes. Right, that's the theory. Okay, so we've got, just to recap, we have social categorization. We go in groups and out groups, and we compare them, in a way that boosts our self-esteem according to the self-esteem hypothesis, which then could lead, which does help the idea of positive distinctiveness, and then that might lead into prejudice. I'm prejudging based on which group you belong to. Then I'm going to discriminate. I'm going to treat my out groups negatively, my in groups positively, so then I can boost my self-esteem by making myself belong to the superior group, and then this discrimination could lead to conflict between the two groups. That's what the theory looks like. Now, where's the studies to support this? The most important studies, probably, or I should say the earliest studies that support this, are the minimal group paradigm studies. Again, let's break down this name. Paradigm. Paradigm is a very common way of doing something. So this is not just one study, but this is it's a common research methodology that have been used in lots and lots of studies. A minimal group. They don't have to, it's putting people into groups that have nothing in common. All right, and so that's the minimal group part of this. So what do? These studies show how believing an anonymous person is in your out group or in group can change how you treat them. All right, so what they did was they took some of the early studies were done in London, and they got schoolboys and they asked them to assign rewards to an in group or an out group, writing on a piece of paper. Now, this is an extract from one of the studies. So this is what the kids, boys had to do. So given this piece of paper, right, imagine they're all sitting in a classroom, sitting at their desks, got these booklets, and they have a pencil, and they're writing down. They didn't actually physically give any rewards. They just had to allocate what they were doing. Now, they're giving a matrix like this, where if they just had to choose one column. So let's say this is, now in this particular group, they were told they were divided based on which painter they preferred. Klee or Kandinsky. Okay, both similar types of painters. If you saw their paintings, they're very hard to tell apart. Abstract expressionist or some modern art thing I don't understand. But anyway, so Klee, so this top column is their in-group. this is a boy who likes Clee, and this is your in-group, right? He also likes Clee. Now remember, look, it's anonymous. They have no idea, and these are all boys that go to the same school, but they don't know who's who, right? It's just completely anonymous. Now, if he says, right, I'm going to give 21 rewards for this guy, that means that he also had to give 17 to the out group. What's interesting here is, right, I'm not sure why he didn't go with 25 and 19, right? Except for the fact that you're having to give more to the out group. But why wouldn't you, right? This one here is actually, yeah, so I don't know why wouldn't you do this, right? Anyway, he's going with 21-17 because maybe he doesn't want to give the out group that many rewards. This is how they did it, right? So they asked him, and then they took the averages. So they gave them different matrices like this and asked them, what would you do? And so here's what they found. Now, this would be the most fair, right? Where you're kind of splitting it evenly. If you were here, it means that if the average was here, it would mean that everyone was 100% biased against the in-group. This would be everyone was 100% biased against the out-group. What we see is a tendency towards favoring our in-group. And I think this average, seeing the specific result here is really important. Right, we're not at this end of the spectrum. The boys weren't at this end of the spectrum, being really, really super biased. But there was a tendency there to give more rewards to the in-group than the out-group. And so this is evidence to support that. Even though it's anonymous, we don't know who's in our group, just belonging to the group can lead you to behave in a biased fashion. That's the fundamental premise of these studies. We see here when it was an in-group member versus an in-group member, people are fair. Out-group versus out-group, it's fair. But when it fair as in not fear of being scared, as in it's equal, right? Equitable. Here we see we have a tendency to be biased towards an out-group, even if that group membership doesn't really mean much. Okay, so that's the first study with the minimal group paradigm studies. Another study, basking in reflected glory, also known as Burging. This was Cialdini in the 1970s. So they gathered data on college campuses. What they did, they on the Saturday in college, they have the college football game. And what they would do is find out, did the college team win or lose? And on Monday, they would have someone sit in the lecture theater and simply count how many people wore college sweaters or t-shirts or apparel that had the college name on it. In other words, how many people were openly identifying with their in-group, which was the college that they belonged to, and did this connect with winning or losing the football game? What they found was that if their football team won, there was an increase in college sweaters, right? People who wore the clothing with the brand on it of the college. Now, this kind of supports the self-esteem hypothesis in that we identify with our successful in-group because it's going to boost our self-esteem. Look, my team's great, we won, I'm a member of this group. Interestingly, other studies have also shown that when you, if your sports team wins, people are more likely to say we. Right? We won, we played great, oh, we just wanted it more than the other team. We're identifying with our victorious group. Now that pronoun changes when they lose. The sports team loses, right? People have been loyal fans, but they lose. Oh, they lost, they blew it, they had the chance it's they. Right? Suddenly they lost, I'm distancing, and we distance ourselves from the losing team. I think that's a really interesting study. And so think about it. Next time someone's talking about their sports team, listen, if they use we or they, depending on if they won or lost. So this is another good study that looks at how in-group identification can be done in order to boost our self-esteem. Last study, we'll look at out-group homogeneity effect. Now this is a pretty complex one, so I might make a whole video on this all by itself. But out-group homogeneity in sorority. So they took 3 sororities at the University of Oregon and they ranked them on 10 dimensions. All right, and what they wanted to see was how they're looking at how the sorority girls would rank their similarity with their in-groups and out-groups, and also how they would rate the groups as well. Would they show in-group bias? So here are some of the dimensions, things like how much they partied, how well they dressed, economic status, how tight their group were, right? So this is what they the 10 traits that they were judging their own group, their own sorority, and the other 2 sororities on. All right, now, so this is going to take a little bit of time to break down the data, but let's have a look here. So this is looking at out-group homogeneity. How similar are the other groups? So the higher the number, the more similar. Okay, so a negative 98 means, oh man, they're judging them as being really different, whereas an 84 is judging them as being very similar. Now, social identity theory and the out-group homogeneity effect would posit that we would rate out-groups as being more similar than our own group. So When B judges A, they're saying, well, they're pretty similar. Look, we're really different, and C's somewhere in the middle. This supports the outgroup homogeneity effect, right? Outgroup is way more similar. Look, we're all individuals. They're more similar. C judging A, really, right? Wow, they're like all the same. Look at us. We're so different. A is somewhat of an anomaly here. A judging A, yeah, we're in the middle. B, yeah, kind of similar. So there's not much variance with A. So I'd say 2 out of 3 of these groups are demonstrating the outgroup homogeneity effect. They're judging the other groups as being way more similar than they're judging themselves. Now, in-group bias. Ethnocentrism is another way of saying in-group bias, where, to put it over simply, they broke it down, those 10 traits, into favorable characteristics and unfavorable. Now, I'm not 100% sure, can't remember which of the ones went into which, because some of them, based on today's standards, I'm not sure in what category they'd fall. But anyway, favorable characteristics. Now, the higher the number, the more they think that that group personifies those things. So, A judging A, going, yeah, I think we're pretty good on that score. B's not bad. Well, C, no, those guys, they're cretins. They're terrible people, right? Here we see in-group bias. They're ranking themselves as the best. B, not so bad. Yeah, we're really good. C, oh man, those guys are devils. They're terrible, right? C's getting a bit of a bad rap here. Now, when C judges, they're like, yeah, they're not so bad. Yeah, we are pretty bad people. So again, we've got 2 out of 3 of the groups are demonstrating in-group bias when it comes to favorable characteristics. Now, here, unfavorable, the higher the number, again, means the more they demonstrate those. A judging A, not so bad. B, is that they're actually saying, yeah, B are really good people. They're not those characteristics at all. C, yeah, very much so. So I'm sort of seeing a trend here with poor old group C, sorority C. But anyway, B saying, not so much. No, we don't personify these characteristics at all. We're very different. C, yes, they definitely personify those characteristics, right? They have those, absolutely. This is showing in-group bias. C, not so much. B, not so much. Yeah, we agree. We're pretty bad. So again, here we're looking at in-group bias. When we're ranking our own group, we tend to rank them positively. When we view outgroups, we tend to view them negatively. This is a good study, I think, that shows in-group bias. Okay, so just to recap, we've got the minimal group studies, Burging and the sorority girls. There's also some biological evidence to support social identity theory and in-groups and out-groups. Some really interesting stuff to look into is the implicit association test and looking at implicit racial bias, and also looking at the amygdala, the emotional center's connection with that. One thing I found really interesting was that in America, the studies tend to be done on white people and black people. I haven't looked at lots of studies that look at other ethnicities, but when white people are shown a black face faster than they are consciously aware of seeing a black face, their amygdala has higher activation than seeing a white face. And there could be some evolutionary explanation for this, that we've evolved to fear outgroup members because of they might be an outgroup member might be damaging to our tribe. They might be a sense of threat. Because what do they care if our tribe survives or not? So anyway, some interesting links here with the amygdala activation, but it gets very complicated, so I think it's best to stick to the social stuff for now, but it's there, and it's also in my book if you want to explore it a bit more. Okay, applications. So we've done the describe, we've done the evidence, now we're getting to the A of making a deal, the applications. First thing, it can explain prejudice and discrimination. We're seeing this all over the world, and we'll continue to see it for a very long time. In extreme cases, could even explain genocide if we're applying it to things like the Holocaust. Why would we want to eliminate whole groups of people when seemingly there are enough resources to go around? So realistic conflict theory can't explain it. So there's some other psychological mechanisms. Interestingly, it could also explain why people join extremist organizations. There's some new research and ideas that are suggesting that people don't join things like ISIS and Islamic extremist groups because they hold those beliefs. Actually, they adapt those beliefs later, but they join those groups because they want to have a sense of belonging to a group. They want to feel that identity within an in-group. And so when they're alienated and marginalized from all other groups and they don't have a sense of belonging, then they might be pushed to these extremes that offer them a sense of belonging to something. And so social identity theory could be explained here. It's also been applied in abnormal psychology, in treatment, understanding the origins. So looking at how low self-esteem, not belonging to groups can affect that symptom of depression. And also at treatment. If we can get people to positively identify with an in-group based on getting group therapy, then that might help reduce stigma attached to having a disorder and can help the treatment process. So this idea of the importance of identifying with a group and having an in-group has been used in psychological disorders. And finally, I saw an interesting study in computer gaming, where there are a lot of studies in computer game look at the negative effects. This one particular study used social identity theory, or looked at computer gaming through the lens of social identity theory, to look at how it might have positive outcomes on self-esteem, because you're playing group games and you're identifying within groups and you're forming group cohesiveness, and that can have a positive effect on self-esteem. So here are 3 ways in which social identity theory has been applied. I think the most important one is the first one. It explains prejudice and discrimination, and we can use this to apply to a range of things. I think if you're writing in an exam, perhaps if you can practice and show your teacher first, get some feedback, but looking at applying SIT to explain a real-life example of prejudice and discrimination, I think that'd be a very good way to show your understanding and the importance of social identity theory. Now, limitations, final points. Now, this is a social approach to understanding conflict, right? We're looking at the social cultural approach to understanding behavior. So does it inherently ignore biological factors? Are there individual factors as well? Are there personality factors or biological factors that could explain why some people might be more likely to be prejudiced or discriminatory? Are there some biological factors that might mean some people are more likely to engage in conflict than others? And so we have to be careful of that. Also, are we ignoring the role of social learning? Could prejudiced attitudes, stereotypes, and discrimination, could these be a product of socialization and social learning and learning from other people around us? Is it all just because we belong to a group, or are there other explanations are there other explanations possible? Could there be cultural differences? And this could be something interesting to explore as well. Might cultural values affect our desire to have in-group superiority? And here I'm thinking about individualism and collectivism primarily. So collectivism, the key idea is that we want to, group harmony is very important, and that we belonging to the group, that's essential, and our sense of identity comes from our belonging to a group, much more so than an individualistic culture. So it stands to reason then that perhaps in collectivist cultures that the mechanisms behind social identity and then explain conflict using social identity theory might be stronger in collectivist cultures than they would be in individualistic cultures, because that desire to belong to a group and identify with a group might not be as strong. So could cultural values affect the difference here? And finally, when we're evaluating theory, we can look at the limitations in the studies. Now, the big one I ask is, can these studies be generalized? Now, remember, Tajfel was in part looking at the Holocaust and extreme examples of discrimination. Now, in the minimal group studies, you're assigning rewards. You're sitting in the classroom with a pen and you're just saying, yep, I give him those rewards, I give this person these rewards. Can this really explain why you would discriminate against, let's use the Holocaust for example, Jewish people, and you would put them in concentration camps and then ultimately execute them and commit murder on a mass scale, right? Men, women, and children. I mean, you got a boy giving in-group and out-group rewards on a pen and paper versus, for example, someone standing in front of a mass grave with a gun shooting people as they fall into the grave. Quite different scenarios. Now, in order to explain why those things might not apply, we have to have a reason. And for one, morality. Humans have an innate sense of, to act morally. Assigning rewards, more rewards or less rewards to an in-group or out-group, it doesn't have many moral consequences. Standing where you are, life and death, and you're directly responsible for killing someone else, there's a moral implication, obligation in this scenario. 2 very different scenarios, so can we apply them? And I think to me, that's the biggest limitation in all the studies. And of course, we can't conduct studies where we actually do have these real life and consequential consequences to our actions. We can't study them for obvious reasons. So if we're looking at kids wearing collared sweaters, or sorority girls ranking each other, or boys offering awards in a classroom, yeah, sure, we might be able to explain limited examples of bias within groups, within very tame social settings. But when we get to the extremes of human behavior, of prejudice, discrimination, and intergroup conflict, I think we really have to ask questions about the value of these studies. There has to be other psychological mechanisms going on, surely. Sorry, I'm just going on a bit of a tangent here. But if you're standing there and you're killing someone, it can't just be because you want your group to be superior than the others. I just can't. I don't think that cuts it. Maybe I've missed something here. Someone who knows social identity theory, maybe far better than me, or I'm overlooking something, can fill in the gaps. But I can see how it's part of it. Definitely a big part of it, but I think it's limited. So there are 3 questions to ask about limitations, I think, to social identity theory. Right, now, after all that, can you make a deal with social identity theory? Can you describe it, summarize it, okay? Can you explain the evidence? If you're writing a short answer question, if you're only preparing the social cultural approach for a short answer question, then choose one of those studies. If you're writing an essay, I would do 2, maybe even 3, or 2 to support it and 1 to contradict it. Or counter it. Can you explain some applications, and can you explain some limitations? Now, my advice in an essay is that you should have 3 counter arguments. So if you're discussing or evaluating, then the evidence and the applications are the strengths. But a discussion needs a review, right? A balanced review, so you have to balance it with the limitations, and evaluation needs strengths and limitations. So I would aim for 2 or 3, okay? I think I'm going to link somewhere here my 3 rules of 3 in my essay writing advice, so you can have a look at that. So check in, can you use social identity theory to explain intergroup conflict, prejudice and or discrimination, or formation of stereotypes? What I would suggest as well, these are 3 topics that are in the new IB Psychology course. Start here. Can you explain stereotypes? Because then if you can, well then the formation of stereotypes could explain prejudice, which then might explain discrimination. This is another topic in human relationships, and then this might explain intergroup conflict. So they kind of bounce off one another. Can you explain at least how one study supports it? And now what's important here when you explain the study, just a tip, one study is not going to support the whole theory. Individual studies will support individual concepts within the theory, or maybe 1 or 2 concepts, but you're not going to find a study that's going to show the self-esteem hypothesis and social categorization and social comparison and outgroup homogeneity. You're not going to find something that's going to do all of it. So choose very carefully what aspect of the theory that you're explaining, and that's going to make your application of the study much stronger. And finally, can you explain strengths and limitations? I really hope that was helpful. If it was, there's another video I'll try and link here about schema theory. That old chestnut, right? Leave a like if it's helpful, because then I know that this type of video is useful. If you've got requests for videos that you would like in our Facebook groups, you can post it there. You can leave a comment if you like. If there's a topic that you need help on, I'd really like to make videos based on requests that people have. And yeah, we've got Facebook groups. I'll put all the links to everything you need to know if you like this and you want to find more information. So thank you. Social identity theory, it's a complex theory that took a long time to explain, but I think once you know it, once you know in-groups and out-groups and how that can affect our behavior, you're going to start seeing it everywhere, and once you start seeing psychology in the real world, then your passion for the subject really fires up. So thanks very much for listening.